So hello, welcome everyone to this EPP Group talk on disinformation and authoritarianism, confronting authoritarianism. Here in the European Parliament, we're talking about that with Vlado Bilčík, MEP of Slovakia, and you're on the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. You're also on that special committee on foreign interference in all democratic processes in the EU, including disinformation. And also joining us from across the pond is Trygve Olsen of the Lincoln Project. Trygve, welcome. It's a think tank over there, I guess you're in Washington, right?
I am in Washington today, yep.
Yeah, so why don't we start with you? I mean, there are the buzz. What's going on there in Washington now a week after, we're talking now Tuesday, a week after the election, the midterm elections. Some things are still up in the air. What we're seeing, though, at the moment is that the Democrats have maintained control of the Senate, but the House is still up for grabs at this point. And yeah, what is your feeling about the election result? And you know, we're talking about disinformation. How much did that play a role in this election campaign in the U.S.?
I think, you know, so on the disinformation question first, you know, disinformation is constantly, and conspiracy theories are constantly moving around in politics, I think, on both sides of the pond. And certainly in the midterm elections, there was a lot of false grievance that was amplified. And on some level, you know, I think a central part of disinformation is sort of the peddling of false grievance more than anything else. And so there was a fair amount of that. How successful it was is another question, right? Because a lot of the people who were trying to push the narrative that elections are stolen or elections aren't legitimate, or the 2020 elections, talking about the 2020 elections, lost.
Yeah, exactly.
And the more crazy they were, they lost by more. You know, one of the big pieces of news is, you know, Republicans stand right now 2 seats short of 217. They're going to get a majority. They're going to have the smallest majority in the last 150 years in the House. And that, I think, is going to probably show to the world that, you know, well, the election night was good for democracy in America. We're far from out of the woods on the threats.
But didn't hey, Trygve, there was a Russian official, I think, who admitted that they were engaging in disinformation during this election campaign. How much of an impact did that have?
You know, it wasn't just any Russian. It was Prigozhin, who's the head of the Wagner Group and Putin's chef.
The Wagner Group, right, right.
And you know, I spent a lot of time in that part of the world working for John McCain and the International Republican Institute. So I did a lot of work in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Yeah, I mean, Prigozhin said that. Quite honestly, I just think, you know, how much impact that stuff was having. It works a lot better when you're not expecting it, right? Like, I think in the U.S. and the EU, we now know that they're doing it. We acknowledge that they do it. It probably is less impactful because, you know, it's usually the things you don't see coming that get you, not the ones that you know are coming.
Right. Let me jump over to Vlado. You're being on that special committee on disinformation. Is there any new developments coming out of there, and anything that in terms of impacting on political campaigns here in Europe?
Well, absolutely. We do have a special committee, and we are also watching very closely what has been happening in the U.S. And maybe just a couple of sentences on this. We are talking a week after the elections. And it's very clear that despite the expectations, that disinformers have not succeeded in these elections. And maybe that is one piece of good news coming out of the U.S. But I agree, we are not out of the woods. There is a lot of disinformation in the run-up to the elections. You know, I saw the announcement before the elections about the election results in the state of Arizona, for instance. And this was one of the examples of the disinformation, which was very viral, very public, and even made it across the pond.
It was a denier against someone who believed in it and actually certified.
Yeah,
right?
and so the fight for truth, the fight for the facts, the fight for credible information is still on. But clearly, the U.S. Democracy has shown a good degree of resilience. This is something which we are also dealing with in the context of our special committee. We have a new, renewed mandate. One of the things we will be looking at very closely in the upcoming weeks and months, and we have started already, is the Defense of Democracy package, which was announced by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, in her State of the Union address. And of course, we are very keen to hear more, because we need to have a comprehensive package which is going to help us safeguard the European elections in 2024, but also a number of elections across the member states. We have a lot of closely watched contests coming up, very, very important national elections across the European Union. And disinformation is one big threat to elections, but there are a number of others. And plus, we have a wholly new context. This is why our committee, I think, is the special committee is even more relevant.
Right.
And that context is Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine.
And this, a lot of this disinformation comes through social networks that are based in the U.S.
Yes. Yes.
So how do you regulate that here and also in the U.S.? How do you do that?
I will be very sort of personal here, because I was in the U.S. with the committee, leading a mission of the special committee in February, just when the war broke out. And we were in Washington, D.C. having a number of meetings. And of course, this was the focal point. But one of the big questions we raised always was the regulation which we in the European Union have pushed through. And I'm very happy and also proud to say that we are the leaders in this field. Digital Services Act is a huge step forward when it comes to regulating horizontally the whole digital environment. It's the first step as well. More needs to be done, and more steps have to come, including the code of practice, which has been revised on how to fight disinformation, and which will be legally binding based on this Digital Services Act. But one of the things we discussed in the U.S. was, well, what do you say? You know, what's your reaction to the European legislation?
Yeah.
And of course, one of our fears was we might get a lot of criticism because we are regulating U.S.-based companies. And what's amazing, and this came from both from a number of policymakers and think tankers, was that, no, we welcome this. We actually are very happy what the Europeans are doing, because we need regulation also in the U.S. Now, there might be different motivations why the regulation has to come in.
Sure.
But I think the Digital Services Act, I hope, will be a good inspiration for others, including the U.S., to have some baseline, because we need to regulate the social platforms. And when I say regulate, I don't mean we need to go against the free speech. But what we need is to give free speech a fair chance. And you can only do it right now through proper rules, through proper regulation, because one of the things we are facing is that these black boxes of algorithms on social platforms have pushed into the forefront disinformation.
It intensifies these echo chambers, right?
It's the intensity of the echo chambers. And this is where we really need to give true information, the facts, verified facts, science, and fact-based political discussion as well, a fair chance, so people who are on social platforms have good access to these kinds of sources.
Trygve, how do you see that on the U.S. side? I know there's an attempt at regulating without censoring. It's a tricky thing, isn't it?
You know, I might have kind of a unique perspective on this compared to a lot of people in the U.S. because, as I said, I spend, over the last 20 years, I've probably spent half my time in Europe. And we kind of split between the two places. But I think it's good when the European side leads, particularly on tech issues.
Why is that? Why?
Well, in part because you're more disassociated from the companies, the major tech companies themselves, right? So you don't have that influence. You have the influence of social media, for example, in your political discourse, but it isn't the lobbying to the same degree. It isn't it's just because they're based here. It tends to be harder to regulate them in some ways. And
because we saw that economic interests, right? Because if you kill them, you're killing jobs, right?
Correct. And this goes all the way back to like, Microsoft and antitrust in the late 90s, right? It was the Europeans who led on that. So I do think I think it's a good thing. I think I think the other reason it's a good thing, if you look at a lot of the disinformation that moves around on social media, it tends to be internal, but there are external forces that drive a lot of it. Like Prigozhin saying he's going to push out disinformation. I will say, I think, if you're a Slovak or you're a Lithuanian or you're a Pole, or even if you're a German or Dutch, you're much more cognizant of, how much messing around can go on in politics or around things like Ukraine, because you've been dealing with it from a closer place.
Sure.
And even if it's your own people who are amplifying it, you just, the U.S., even to this day with the Russians messing around, certainly in the intelligence community and the foreign policy community, there's an understanding and a recognition, but we don't want to admit that, that can happen to us. You guys are much more clear-eyed on it.
Okay, that's interesting. Vlado, let me ask you too about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. How much concern is there that he's going to sort of release the beasts again in the interest of calling it free speech, but there's also that disinformation aspect too, right?
Well, coming back to the U.S. election, there was some speculation that former President Trump might be back on Twitter. He isn't.
Yeah.
So that's also a bit of an indication in terms of answering your question.
Because he's worried about the economic side too, about if he does let it go too wild, he's going to lose his advertisers, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is, I'm not following it on an hourly or daily basis, but of course I operate on Twitter, just like many of the members of this House and the whole policymaking committee. It's an extremely important channel and particular platform, which is very important, very useful to us. But I think there is a whole question here which is bigger, and that's the long-term survival of Twitter. Because there seems to be so much uncertainty, even a degree of chaos in terms of the messages we've seen from Elon Musk since he has been in charge. And often these messages are sort of, let's try this and let's then reverse, let's try this, let's then reverse. So I think clearly there is a bigger question mark about the future of Twitter. I think we need...
we need something like Twitter.
We need something like Twitter, and whether or not Twitter is going to be that Twitter in 5 or 10 years' time, I don't think anybody knows at the moment. Yeah. But I think it's also important, and this is where I come back to the regulation we've passed in the European Union. By 2024, the Digital Services Act, and I hope sooner, and we are pushing for quick implementation, we will really have the reins in our hands. And when I say we, the institutions, the policymakers. And so in terms of the European context, at the very least, the kind of Twitter or any other platform which will operate here will be subject to these rules. And I very much hope that by then these rules will be a lot more global. This is our hope. So
it serves as a standard that others might adopt.
Yes, it's not just up to the CEOs of these companies to make these decisions, because I think this is something we saw also in the aftermath of the 6th of November after the presidential elections. We need to have rules to anticipate these sorts of even tragic events.
Sure.
And these rules cannot just come out of a back room of a corporation. We need to have rules which protect the public interest, which protect and safeguard the institutions of democracy. And as I say, yes, we need to protect free speech. But that protection also goes hand in hand with general rules in terms of what is responsible media, what is independent media, what is a fair chance for free speech in the online space.
That's what your committee is all about, that special committee. Trygve, what's the feeling then about Trump, about Elon Musk taking over Twitter? I mean, how much concern is there that there could be more disinformation because of that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of controversy around Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and in reality, both sides are beating up on Elon Musk at the moment. And Here's the thing. At the end of the day, the bad thing about Twitter is it is the way it is, and you have some, you put a tweet out, you can get some real hate at times, and a
Yeah.
lot of disinformation and stupidity.
Yeah.
But what I also think we have to understand is, if Twitter disappear, the good thing about Twitter is everybody, for the most part, is on Twitter. What I think is a more dangerous and dystopian future would be if everybody on the right has their own flavors that fit what they already believe, and they're only networked with people who believe what they believe.
You
And
mean
people
like
on the left,
yeah.
same thing.
Yeah, you mean like Truth
And you end,
Social, Truth Social.
correct,
Trump's thing.
correct.
Yeah.
And
Which is
that
not taking
is,
off. That's an
no,
interesting
it hasn't.
thing. Yeah.
It has not. But if Twitter disappeared, right, there becomes an economic incentive for a bunch of people to try and build the Twitter. And, we have seen, and you have in Europe, right, like right-wing newspapers, left-wing newspapers in some countries. Certainly we have Fox News, MSNBC, self-selecting media. Self-selecting social media only furthers the sort of dopamine hit that people get, because everything they put out is only going to be going to an audience that agrees with it, even the most egregious and crazy.
Yeah.
And then you get into a
Right.
position where, you're having to shut businesses down because, they may have reprehensible business models, but that only creates further grievance around which extremism and radicalization can take place, and around which bad actors can amplify
Yeah.
those grievances. I think the thing that we have to get with technology is, technology is agnostic. We live in a world of good and evil people, and evil actors are going to use technology for evil ends. And most people who are good, 99.9% of people I believe are good, are going to use it for good reasons. They're going to use Facebook to share pictures, but there's always going to be those bad actors. We have to figure out how to stop that. And so,
well, there's too a question of just the public having a more critical eye, and there's education there too. Vlado, you wanted to.
I wanted to react to this because I think what we are facing at the moment, and also discussing in part, is with the regulation of the social platforms, is how they have to adjust and change their business model to survive, because I think that regulation is a new reality. And that regulation is here also to protect the public interest, to protect the institution of democracy, to protect, indeed, as has been said, the fact that we have a common understanding of a common democratic space, but not these little boxes in which we live and which don't communicate with each other. And that's part of the problem, which has been the basis of huge profits for the social platforms, because that's been tied to advertisement, and of course they need to adjust the business model, and that goes for all social platforms. But I also want to say this is bigger than social platforms, and just as Trygve was saying, this media, that media. We have a big discussion, and this is going to be part of our committee's work as well, on Media Freedom Act, which is coming to Europe. It's a European legislative proposal to protect the media space, to protect the work of journalists, the independence of journalists, but also the professionalism of journalists and the media. And I think it's very dangerous if and when we start talking in the democracy that we have left-wing media, we have right-wing media, we have pro-government media, we have opposition media. I think that is, quite frankly, ultimately a road to hell when it comes to protecting and safeguarding the institution of democracy. In my view, we only have good or bad media. We have either professional, independent, free media with journalists who really are not only able, but also free to do their work. Their only commitment is to good quality journalism based on facts. Or we have all of those who pretend to be media, but basically they have either political or business agenda, and that's the only goal they are following.
So that's one way to confront autocrats using disinformation to stay in power.
Absolutely.
Are there other ways to do that, especially when they're using social networks?
We have to be out front with autocrats. I mean, Putin has started a brutal war against Ukraine. I think this has really woken up a lot of Democrats to the realities of what autocrats can do. This is not just about Prigozhin and the Russians who have been trying now for years to undermine democracy, not just in the US, but also in Europe. And they're doing it in a very plastic way, not just across the European Union, also in our neighborhood. The Russians are attacking one of our successful policies directly in Ukraine, killing people in Ukraine, killing Ukraine as a state, as an identity, and Ukraine is a candidate state for EU accession. And they're doing the very same thing in another region which we have been looking at very closely, which is also close to my heart, and that's the Western Balkans. Thanks to disinformation, thanks to the breakdown of good quality public media, the Western Balkans has now become fertile ground for autocratic regimes, but also for the influence of autocrats from Russia, from China. I think we really have to be very vocal about our own values, about the democratic principles, but also about the cornerstone of those values and institutions. And free, independent, quality media is one of those. And also, fair chance for free speech on online platforms is another one.
So, Trygve, how do you see that too? I mean, how do we confront authoritarians who stay in power, especially as we're seeing with the war in Ukraine, with Putin's war in Ukraine?
Well, I think, you know, in this, I was saying, I think before we got on, one of the things about the elections here in the States, you know, the perception, certainly, as I've talked to European friends, is, well, it was a great night for democracy. It was, but you also have a U.S. House, which is responsible for passing aid to Ukraine, which is now going to be under Republican control. And in some ways, because it's so close, there's already deal cutting by, you know, 3 or 4 members can cut a deal prior to the leadership elections. And there are ones who are demanding that the U.S. no longer provide aid to Ukraine. The best way that we can confront them on the macro level is being unified in our opposition to them and standing together as the democratic nations. You know, I started in 2000 IRI, the International Republican Institute's Belarus program, and was eventually declared an enemy of the Belarusian state by Lukashenko. But if I achieved one thing during my time there, it was helping unify the U.S., the Europeans, and getting everybody on the same page just by bringing people together to talk about it. And we stand up to Putin by standing together. And I spent my life in Republican politics. I worked for McCain for a number of years. I'm now part of the Lincoln Project, which opposes Trump and Trumpism. But I will tell you, Joe Biden has done a really good job of leading, not always from the front, but he's done a really good job of having Europeans lead. And, you know, it's one of the things that he gets criticized for in the States. Well, you know, he's letting others lead. We're a better world when on things like Ukraine, Europe is leading.
Do you think disinformation is playing a role in supporting those who are calling for reducing support of Ukraine?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the lines that Marjorie Taylor Greene, I don't know if you guys know who Marjorie Taylor Greene is, but she's this right-wing lunatic in the House, from Georgia. She has been using the figure $500 billion has gone to Ukraine. Well, that's not true. What she's doing is she's adding up all the spending bills that have included Ukrainian aid, which is a small part of big spending bills. She's added them all up, but that has taken hold. I mean, it moved around massively before the election that we've somehow given $500 billion to Ukraine, which is more money, quite frankly, than any other country's military budget except for the United States, even more than China spends on the record. Well, that's ridiculous, but they've amplified that.
Okay. Vlado, you wanted to add something on that?
Absolutely. Disinformation is a huge part of this war. And it's also potentially undermining the unity, which is so crucial. And I agree with Trygve. We need to work together inside the European Union. We need to work together as democracies across the Atlantic with other like-minded countries. And we need to pull together behind Ukraine because this war has no end in sight. We are in for a long haul. and we must win. And when I say we must win, Ukraine must win, but also we as Europeans, Americans, and other democracies together must win. And disinformation is something which could really threaten these efforts.
And this
one example, just to give you one example, because we had one from across the pond. One example which has become very vocally known is that the sanctions against Russia are responsible for all the social problems we are facing in Europe with the rising energy prices.
Yes, of course.
And of course, this is a huge lie. It's a huge hoax, unfortunately spread also by some politicians across the European Union, even some leaders of some member states.
Sure.
It's extremely unfortunate, but it's a hoax because Putin and his regime has been using energy prices, gas prices, since 2009 as a weapon against us. And sanctions are the best possible reaction in given circumstances, which help us help Ukraine and also help us really face Russia, which has started this brutal aggression and which must fail in these efforts. So I think this is really important that we realize that disinformation is a weapon. It's a weapon which the Russians have used for a long time. We have to not only debunk it, but we have to become a lot more resilient together to be able to face it. And this is why we also need rules for social platforms. This is why we need to support free and independent media. And this is why we have to work together with our American partners. And we need this leadership beyond these elections, beyond these midterms, because that's the only way we sustain a unified effort with respect to Putin.
Yeah, it has to be done on a global
can I add
level.
one
Yes,
thing on
yes,
that?
Trivia, yes, please.
It's such a good point about what you're saying with the energy side of things, and we're seeing that as well. That they push out disinformation on the left, right? That Europe can't survive without Russian energy and meet climate change and other goals. I would say that one of the things, and I don't think this gets talked enough about in terms of the whole issue, and it impacts disinformation too. We need a transatlantic energy security policy that basically covers both the U.S., Europe, natural gas, for example. There's an excess natural gas in the United States. How you get that to Bavaria to power the factories? Probably it's LNG terminals, but like we need to address that. And honestly, in a strange way, addressing the energy issue and the security issue together, which are related, goes a long way to solving some of those other issues that we've been talking about.
Right. Just as an aside before we wrap up, what's your feeling about Donald Trump expected to make a big announcement today? What do you expect to happen, and what would be the impact?
So, the establishment is doing the traditional establishment of the Republican Party is going all in to try and take Trump out. Donald Trump is going to run. Donald Trump still maintains a substantial support of his base, whether it's more than DeSantis or a majority or not, that's unclear. But he holds massive sway over a lot of people on the right.
Even though many Republicans are distancing themselves in these last few days from him and his policies. Correct.
But here's the thing. Those people, they're trying, the Mitch McConnells of the world, the Kevin McCarthy's, the major donors, the Rupert Murdochs, they're trying to push Trump out. This is the thing that, though, you have to ask yourself, is Donald Trump a guy who is going to let someone else have it? I mean, if Ron DeSantis becomes the nominee and beats Donald Trump in a primary, is Donald Trump going to be the guy who says, yep, now I'm with DeSantis, or is he the guy who's going to burn the house down if he can't have the house?
Yeah.
And that's the problem that the Republicans have. And that isn't going to end, no matter how much they try and talk their way out of it.
Yeah. I think a final thought, Vlado, or are you good at this point?
Just maybe on this point.
Okay.
We have another important glue, and I want to mention that across the Atlantic. And I agree we need to work together on energy, on security, and also defense. And we've seen how important NATO has been in this context. We are in the European Parliament, but we are in Brussels. It's also the seat of NATO. And I talked about EU enlargement, but actually NATO enlargement is happening, and I hope we can soon welcome Sweden and Finland, and that's one of the big consequences of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. NATO is becoming stronger. And the West is becoming stronger. We need to maintain this. And I remember the 4 years of Trumpian politics in the US were something which really were not helpful times for us in Europe, in the whole cooperation also within the defense establishment. So I very much hope, and fingers crossed, that the Trumpian politics is not the politics which is going to be dominant in the US in either of the parties. And I do hope that the Republicans find a candidate which is going to be able to work in the old spirit of good transatlantic cooperation.
Vlado Trygve, thank you so much for being with us, discussing this. And we'll just have, this is a thing constantly developing, and there is this special committee here in the European Parliament looking at disinformation, so there will be constant developments coming out of that. We look forward to hearing more from you, Vlado, on that as well. For all of those watching, listening, at EPP Group is the handle for any kind of tweets you'd like to make. And yes, we do like you to tweet when you tweet the truth. And more information for this and other issues at eppgroup.eu. My name is Chris Burns. See you next time.